If you've ever had a software update on your computer, last Friday, we had the software update to end all software updates. This one impacted Microsoft users, and it shut down more than 8.5 million computers around the world.
I was among the world's many victims. It was, what's known as the blue screen of death.
That's Joseph Menn. He's a technology reporter covering cybersecurity for The Post.
Where, Microsoft's warning that, nothing works. It pops up in bright blue with a frowny face. And that's what people were looking at. And when they tried to reboot, they would just get it again. So there was no way out of it.
This outage happened because of a cybersecurity company called CrowdStrike. CrowdStrike pushed a faulty update to Windows devices, and the resulting outage unleashed chaos on our most essential systems.
Massive tech outages are impacting airlines, businesses, offices, companies worldwide. The meltdown has affected computers running Microsoft software. Now,
Airplanes were grounded, flights canceled, thousands of passengers stranded in airports worldwide.
We're talking about 1,200 flight delays already today. It's only 7 a.m. More than 750 flights canceled because of this.
Hospitals had to turn away non-emergency patients.
Emory, one of several healthcare systems impacted, procedures at ambulatory surgery centers and hospitals delayed until systems stabilized.
Banks, businesses, government offices, even court hearings all had problems.
L.A. County Superior Court is experiencing connectivity issues affecting its operations. The court decided to push back hearings for everyone who was scheduled.
It was all nuts. It may be the largest IT outage ever. The most widespread computer network failure.
So how did this happen? How did one little software update upend the entire world? From the newsroom of the Washington Post, this is Post Reports. I'm Elahe Izadi. It's Thursday, July 25th. Today, we're still dealing with the CrowdStrike outage. Hundreds of flights were canceled this week. Some estimates say that the damages and lost revenue could be more than $1 billion. So we have Joseph on to explain just how this faulty update caused all this and what this incident says about the state of the cybersecurity industry. So, Joseph, I want to first really understand more about this company, CrowdStrike. I personally have never heard of CrowdStrike before. What is CrowdStrike?
So CrowdStrike is one of the more sophisticated security software companies in the world. So there are really kind of two parts of CrowdStrike. One is the agent that is on many people's computers, even if they don't know it, because their employer has bought a license to it from CrowdStrike. It's like souped up antivirus, it detects known threats, and that is fairly deep inside the computer. But the other half of CrowdStrike is what's called threat intelligence, which is like sort of on the line between, security research and intelligence work. They look for when something seriously bad is happening, like a hacking attack against Microsoft, for example, that allows the perpetrators to get into Microsoft customers, like the U.S. government. CrowdStrike is one of the firms that will really dig deep into it and try to figure out not only what happened technically, but the specific people behind it. So they're very prominent in that more insular world of intelligence as it relates to hacking.
Mm-hmm. And then who are their clients? It sounds like mostly corporate clients. And how big of a company is this?
Well, they're quite big in security. So their market cap until recently was above $70 billion, which is very big for a standalone security company. They have many government clients in addition to big corporations. And one of the sad ironies of it is that because they're one of the more sophisticated high-end vendors, the more sensitive your industry, the more it needs to avoid hacking and failure. So think transportation and power generation and
like hospitals.
Hospitals.
Oh, wow, yeah.
Yeah, healthcare. Those are the most likely to have CrowdStrike.
So what was the first sign on Friday that something had gone wrong with CrowdStrike? What did that look like?
Well, in the beginning, you didn't know that. All you knew was that your computer was dead. For many people, they found out when they got to the office, or if they worked from home, when they booted up and got the blue screen of death. And, in the beginning, there was these hyperventilating reports. And because the world waking up to this started in Asia and then in Europe, where CrowdStrike is not, there wasn't a lot of good local information in the news media about it. And then there was some news media that was knocked offline by it. So it was actually kind of hard to figure out. It wasn't till later in the day that CrowdStrike put out something saying, hey, this is our fault, but we can fix it.
And just to be clear, Joseph, this only affected Microsoft computers. Why is that?
Well, because like many pieces of software, CrowdStrike has different versions. They have a version for Mac, and they have a version for Linux. This particular update only went to Windows machines.
And so in the meantime, there's all this mayhem and chaos. It seemed like I know that there were a lot of airline passengers stranded at airports because of flight cancellations. What were some of the other ripple effects of this?
Well, a scary one is the 911 call centers that depend on Microsoft that went down. Not all of them, but many of them for a while. And some banks were affected very badly. And car dealerships. And the healthcare ones are really bad. So you had a situation where hospitals are saying no to planned non-necessary surgery. Anything that can be put off was put off.
And so what did CrowdStrike say was the problem here?
Well, I mean, the first thing they said is this is not a cyber attack.
Do we know that for certain?
I would be very surprised if it turns out to be a cyber attack at this point. They have said in securities filing that this was not an attack. They'd be in big trouble if it was an attack.
Mm-hmm. And so then what did they say was the cause?
They said it was a one-time mistake in an update that they sent automatically to Windows machines, and that update was faulty. And so what users needed to do is manually delete one of the system files that they'd sent, and then everything would be okay.
Okay, Joseph, I do want to understand this because you're talking about a single program update error causing a global outage. And I want to understand how that happens because program update error sounds like a pretty boring, basic thing software companies do all the time. If whatever kind of computer you have, you say, oh, get this update. And then maybe, if you're me, you put it off for a while and then you finally do it. But it just seems like a benign thing. And how is it that this one thing can cause such a massive problem? So can you just break this down for me? How do these updates typically work?
Let's put it this way. There are updates and then there are updates. So, sometimes programs and, your apps or whatever will just update in the background and they're adding new emojis or something, that doesn't really matter. Some apps have deeper access than other apps. And security apps have deep access to the way Windows functions, which means if they screw up an update that is beyond just, hey, here's this new virus, if they're giving more technical information, that amounts to, new programming. And anytime you're pushing a new program into production, things can go wrong, especially if it's not tested thoroughly. And certainly the consensus here is that this was not tested thoroughly.
But we begin with that massive Microsoft technology outage.
What they did is they took an update that they had not tested, they had not correctly vetted, and they just sent it out to millions and millions of users.
And it was one of those things. This particular system update was to try to stop a recent bad guy method of communicating within Windows.
The security firm CrowdStrike pushed a faulty or flawed update to their Falcon threat detection platform, which is causing...
And so they were trying to monitor and block certain kinds of communications deep inside Windows.
So it's operating in real time. It needs deep system access to try to monitor for threats. And
the way in which they did their update was for a very sensitive part of the system. So it didn't just cause a minor software glitch on computers that were otherwise up and running, but it actually caused them to fail to boot.
And they screwed it up. They asked the computer to execute a function that it couldn't, and so it crashed.
The system was sent an update, and that update had a software bug in it and caused an issue with the Microsoft operating system.
So one of the challenges for CrowdStrike was getting out the word to its customers, many of whom had blue screens of death. So CEO George Kurtz went on television to explain what happened on NBC's Today Show.
And we identified this very quickly and remediated the issue. And as systems come back online, as they're rebooted, they're coming up and they're working. And now we are working with each and every customer to make sure that we can bring them back online. But
so how did CrowdStrike end up fixing this big error?
So CrowdStrike actually figured out what went wrong pretty quickly, and they wanted to roll back that update. The problem is that it had already been deployed into millions of machines and had bricked those machines. And if those machines are bricks, you can't tell them to undo what they've already done. The only way to do it is to reboot manually each single machine and have somebody in control of that machine type something in, which is actually a fairly long string of characters.
So it's not like that they could do it remotely. It's like they have to physically interact with the computer.
That's right. There is no way for CrowdStrike to do it remotely, at least not over the first several days. And, even if you've got, Bob in IT, if Bob in IT at, some big company, he can't go around to all the hundreds of desks in headquarters, let alone the remote workforce, and do it all himself. So there were, lots of IT departments worked around the clock to try to do that, but they also had to figure out a way to talk the solution to each individual employee. And that just took time and people.
Shout out to Bob in IT. We love Bob in IT, or in our case, Liz in IT.
That's right. That's right. Ours was Liz in IT, and she saved a lot of people. CrowdStrike doesn't have an enormous support staff, though, so they were kind of overwhelmed. And so it took a little effort to get what the fix was and what to do. But when many people got into the office and they would get instructions one way or another from their IT people and would tell them what to do. Bizarrely, one of the things that worked sometimes, and Microsoft even endorsed this, was rebooting 15 times in a row.
Oh my gosh, 15 times.
It has to do with just a way to break the cycle, break the connection, and timing.
My gosh.
It was not foolproof. But anyway, the way you were supposed to fix it was you're supposed to boot into safe mode or recovery mode, and then get a command prompt, and then type DEL space a bunch of numbers, .sys, which was the bad update file from CrowdStrike.
So while CrowdStrike says that it's solved most of the issue, it does, we are days out after that, and it does seem like there are still effects of that initial error being felt. For instance, just early this week, Delta had to cancel hundreds of flights. It was attributing it to this in part. What other industries are still struggling after all of this, and why?
So healthcare, about maybe 80% of hospitals hit by this were recovered, and CrowdStrike is in maybe 50% of hospitals in the U.S. They've had a slower recovery in part because of the sort of multi-layered dependency where Windows depends on CrowdStrike, and then the Windows machines are not just their own computers, but sometimes they control medical devices, scanning equipment, all these other systems. You can't just reboot the Windows machine itself and get all the other things working. You have to, run new software and get it all set up again. And that can take a fair amount of time. And famously, hospitals don't spend a whole bunch of money on IT. That's not, they're trying to save lives, not to have the latest and greatest, version of Windows and software that runs on top of Windows. There's just not as many IT geniuses running around hospitals as there are other industries.
After the break, Joseph and I talk about this outage raising new questions about our reliance on Microsoft. We'll be right back. Joseph, at this point, I would like to step back and learn a little bit more about where this outage fits in the history of tech failures. Has anything of this scale happened before?
So this may be the most widespread IT outage of all time. But there are others that were worse because they actually destroyed the machines. There was no way to reboot. So two of the most destructive attacks, one is called WannaCry, which was this North Korean authored ransomware, which malfunctioned. So it wound up being destructive, kind of escaped from the lab. That was several years ago.
The Trump administration is blaming North Korea for a massive cyber attack. The White House says Pyongyang is directly responsible for the WannaCry virus that affected hospitals, businesses, and banks worldwide earlier this year.
And also several years ago was something called NotPetya. And NotPetya was attributed to the Russians.
The cyber weapon NotPetya started in Ukraine in June of 2017. It quickly spread, paralyzing major companies and causing more than $10 billion in damage.
It was mainly an attack on Ukraine. And what they did is they got into the update process. Ironically, another way of getting access, as we've seen with this one. They got into the update process for a very common Ukrainian tax software package, and they sent a bad update that users of that tax package, it wiped out their machines. It deleted files that the computer needed to function. And that hit not just many Ukrainian businesses, but also companies that did business with Ukraine. So big shipping companies, Merck was hit. The damages in that one is in the billions. Because all those computers were gone. So there's all the lost revenue from when they couldn't operate, but also they had to get new computers. That was worse, but it wasn't as widespread.
So, Joseph, right now I want to ask you about Y2K because I saw people bringing this up during this outage. And if people remember, Y2K was this thing where everyone was worried that the whole world economy was shut down when the year transitioned from 1999 to 2000 because computers were not programmed to deal with that transition. And it turns out we were fine because tech experts got in there and made sure we'd be okay and there'd be no glitch. But this outage feels like if Y2K actually happened. And it makes me think about in the lead up to Y2K, everyone was talking about, oh, we're too reliant on computers. And so doesn't this outage raise that question again? Are we too reliant on computers and specifically Microsoft?
Well, first of all, it is an ugly reminder of how interconnected and dependent we are, not just on Microsoft, but the whole ecosystem that lives on top of Microsoft, which is a lot of basically anyone in the software business wants to have something running on Windows because Windows is everywhere. And we're more dependent now than we were in 99. So that's an unnerving fact. And in terms of too dependent on Microsoft specifically, well, yeah, I mean, they're a court-decreed monopolist. People in Congress want to know why the Pentagon uses so much Microsoft when they could have other vendors. And one of the issues is that if you have Microsoft to run your basic Office functions, and you also have Microsoft to run your security and to do authentication, then there's kind of a single point of failure. And that's bad. You should, spread it out a little bit to have somebody else do your authentication or whatever. But frequently government procurement processes, say you should have buy the cheapest thing that works. And so that has led to all Microsoft shops in lots of government. So anyway, the Federal Trade Commission told us that they're interested in what happened and whether there are antitrust competitive implications of this.
Have lawmakers called for any sort of accountability in response to this outage?
Yes. So this was a big enough issue that members of Congress have asked for testimony from the CEO of CrowdStrike, George Kurtz, to testify. That's expected to happen soon. Others are still looking at it, and they're all getting briefings from both federal officials and from CrowdStrike as to what went wrong.
What is preventing this happening again? Has CrowdStrike said anything about what they're going to do to avoid this in the future?
So CrowdStrike, to its credit, has put out a couple of updates on what it knows about what happened and what to do differently, and helped with tools to recover machines. But they have promised a full accounting of what happened.
We're deeply sorry for the impact that we've caused to customers, to travelers, to anyone affected by this, including our companies. So
CrowdStrike has got to come out and say, well, this specific process went wrong. We didn't test it because of this. And see how many customers they keep. They're really in the crosshairs now.
Joseph, when I step back and really think about this, there are two things that come up for me. First, I think, wow, computer systems are ultimately built and run by humans who aren't perfect, make mistakes. So in that sense, should we be so surprised when errors happen? On the other hand, there is a multi-billion-dollar industry dedicated to computer security and making sure there are processes to prevent this sort of thing. So where does this leave us?
Well, the security industry to me is the most dramatic example of failing upwards that I can think of in the corporate world. I mean, objectively, the whole computer security industry has failed us. Hacks are, there were more hacks than ever. Ransomware is still billions of dollars. The state of security is terrible. And yet, the stocks of security companies and the number of security companies keep going up because people keep wanting a solution. And so you wind up having security tool on top of security tool in your computer. The other unfortunate thing is that many security services and software, many of those things actually make security worse. It gives a wider what's called attack surface. Because they have this sort of deep access that we've learned that CrowdStrike has, they're a terrific vector for hackers to use. So break into a security company or figure out what's wrong, find a new flaw in a security company's software, and use that to break into their customers. I'm afraid that happens fairly commonly. So the security industry has not done a good job, in part because the economic incentives are wrong.
Joseph, thank you so much for making time for us today.
Sure, thanks for having me.
Joseph Menn is a technology reporter covering cybersecurity for The Post. Yesterday, CrowdStrike issued a full incident report that provided more details about this faulty update. CrowdStrike said it would improve testing in the future and give customers control over whether small updates are installed immediately. Before we go, I wanted to share some other headlines I'm watching today.
Well, welcome back, Mr. Prime Minister. We got a lot to talk about. I think we should get to it. The floor is yours.
Today, President Biden met with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu at the White House. The two met a day after Netanyahu gave a defiant speech in front of Congress. He asked for support in Israel's war and said the country would settle for, quote, nothing less than total victory over Hamas.
My friends, if you remember one thing from the speech, remember this. Our enemies are your enemies. Our fight is your fight. And our victory will be your victory.
He also derided the thousands of people in Washington, D.C. yesterday protesting Israel's actions in Gaza. Dozens of Democratic lawmakers and at least one Republican boycotted his speech. Netanyahu will also meet with Vice President Harris, and he'll speak with former President Donald Trump tomorrow. And there are some big changes for loyal Southwest passengers. Today, Southwest Airlines announced it's getting rid of its unique model of having passengers choose their seats only once they're aboard the plane. Southwest will instead assign seats ahead of time and charge a premium for certain seats, like ones with more legroom. But the change won't happen overnight. Southwest planes still need to be reconfigured, and expect more details in September. This change comes as Southwest tries to boost revenue. The airline says their customers have been clamoring for this change, but, some of us do like the thrill of getting on the plane and trying to score the perfect seat. That's it for Post Reports. Thanks for listening. Today's show was produced by Ali Bianco, with help from Sabby Robinson and Trinity Webster Bass. It was mixed by Sean Carter and edited by Rena Flores and Ariel Plotnick. Thanks to James Graff. I'm Elahe Izadi. We'll be back tomorrow with more stories from The Washington Post.